Okay, so I'll start my pithy introductions and then we'll probably gather a few more people as that's ongoing. So welcome everyone to this week's iteration in the History Department workshop. Today we are here to discuss a selection from Erika X. Lee's America for Americans, A History of Xenophobia in the United States. Our discussion today is going to be led by History Department grad student Sishu Liu, with an introduction by Dr. Akiko Takanaka. And I just wanted to mention that Dr. Lee will be visiting UK next week and giving a lecture. And so we're sort of working in conjunction with that visit here. But it's also a very timely and engaging book, and I hope you enjoyed reading it. I know I did too with my Lexington Public Library book, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion. So what I'm going to do is just briefly introduce our first speaker, and then we're going to hear from Dr. Takanaka and Sishu, and then we'll have a broader discussion of the shared reading and the themes in it. So Akiko Takanaka is an associate professor of history at the University of Kentucky and the author of Yasukuni's Shrine, History, Memory, and Japan's Unending Post-War. Her current book project is entitled Mothers Against War, Gender and Grassroots Peace Activism in Post-War Japan. And she's currently teaching the course Asians in America. And so she has the perspective from that course to lend to our discussion today. So thanks, Akiko.
Okay, hi. So Erika Lee's work has been really central to the course that I'm teaching right now, Asians in America. She has published widely, initially on the Chinese immigration experience, and her first book is At America's Gates, Chinese Immigration During the Exclusion Era, 1882 to 1843. And then she co-authored a book called Angel Island, Immigrant Gateway to America, right? Angel Island is sort of like the Western counterpart to Ellis Island that people don't talk about enough. And then she wrote this book that I'm using very much for my class, The Making of Asian America. And so and with Making of Asian America, she sort of expanded all the Asian immigration experience from just the Chinese experience to all Asian experience. And then with the new book, America for Americans, A History of Xenophobia in the United States, which you read 2 chapters from, it expanded the immigrant experience even further to encompass not just Asia, but also immigration from Europe and beyond. And an interesting tidbit that I learned from reading her previous book is that her great-great-great-grandfather was one of the earliest immigrants from China to the United States, came with the rumor of gold in California, right? So there was a rush of immigration from China during the gold rush. And so her great-great-great-grandfather came. He was a little late for the gold, but he became a very successful businessman in the United States. But as was the case with many Chinese immigrants of the time period, he kind of went back and forth between China and the United States. And he sort of created a family back in China, but did business in the United States. His son did the same, sort of traveling back and forth between China and the United States. And I think it was her great-grandfather or that generation that finally settled into the United States. So the Chinese immigration experience is really fascinating, and she has been very influential in putting the Chinese immigration experience onto the map of immigration experiences more generally. And in one of her earlier articles, she argues about so she was the first person to say that no, Asian immigration wasn't anomaly. It was what really shaped immigration policies and laws in the United States, and especially the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 really shaped US immigration, and a lot of the border control issues, or even these like interviews when one needs to go through to get a green card. I did that like 20-something years ago because I got my green card based on a previous marriage, and like all those things are really based on the methodologies and technologies that were created in order to really control immigration from Asia. And I said I was going to talk for just a couple of minutes, so I'm going to stop now. But her work is amazing. Her talk is next Thursday at 4 p.m. and I will try to remember to send out an invitation again. There are 3 book discussions next week based on the entire book, sort of getting us ready for the talk. And our very own Sushi Liu, who is going to lead the discussion today, is also leading a discussion next week, Wednesday at, was it noon?
3 p.m.
3. Oh, yeah. Must change my calendar. All right.
Are you sure it says 1 p.m. in the?
Oh no, it's 1. I think. Oh, the 3 is another one. I'm sorry. Yeah, I think it's 1. I will post the link to all these separate reading groups here. Can you see it?
Like repost.
Yep, I just reposted it once. Yep.
Okay. Great. So once she's done reposting all the links to the relevant book discussions and the talk itself, he is now going to lead the discussion for today. And I guess I should also say that Sushi Liu is a graduate student, hopefully close to becoming a PhD candidate rather than a student soon. Pressure, is going to lead the discussion for today. So now with this, I am going to turn the microphone over to you, Sushi.
Okay, thank you so much. So my name is Liu. You can just please call me Liu. I think that's the best way to call me by name. And I think that the topic of this book is really relevant in the world that we are living in today, especially the topic, America for Americans, a history of xenophobia in the United States. So as the very beginning, the very first question I want to raise and I want people to discuss about is the title of the book, A History of Xenophobia in the United States. And think of this, the question I want to raise is, what do you think is the difference or the connection between these terms, xenophobia, nativism, and racism? And why, after reading these 2 chapters, why do you think like Erika Lee, Dr. Lee, decide to use xenophobia as the title of this book instead of something like nativism or a history of racism?
Well, xenophobia is sort of a more encompassing term, right? Fear of the foreign. And so racism, nativism, a particular angle of xenophobia, I guess maybe she preferred. And I have not read more than about 10 pages of the book. So I'm not sure an answer to your question why she chose to use the more encompassing term here, but I would say that maybe is part of the rationale.
Yeah, I was going to say that if we had read the chapter on the Irish or on the lesser races of Southern and Eastern Europe, of which there's several representatives among those at this talk, that we would either have to include racism against other whites or just talk about xenophobia, including anti-Catholicism, which was very strong, is very strong in England against Irish as well.
So I grapple with this question a lot in my own work, and I was really excited to talk about this because it's a good question. Like the question about terms is huge. And I don't have an answer, but I always have to grapple with how to address those terms. Now, obviously, I think xenophobia speaks more broadly to the question of whiteness against others, and that doesn't always apply to the other terms. So, I write about Mexican Americans who were, I would say, extremely nativist for a long time. Even as they were also on the receiving end of horrible racism. So I guess the context really matters in how we frame each case, but it is an interesting question. I don't have an answer for it, but I've in my own work deal with this question all the time, and I do notice that often, you know, these very people who are on the receiving end of racism can also display a great deal of nativism. I'm not sure that xenophobia would work in that, to say that they display xenophobia, but they do certainly display a lot of nativist sentiment.
Yeah, on the question of nativism, I was really interested in the introduction to the book. She says that nativism as a term actually is very specific in its origins to talking about the claim by white Protestants to the actual land of the United States, right, or to the North American continent. And then it's used to describe other groups. Similar sentiment is something done by extension. And I guess she's saying that it's been a historiographical move, but that was surprising to me, maybe in a similar way to that Eladia was talking about, because if I look at my context of looking at 19th century China, where you have a mix of ethnic groups in an imperial context, you do have nativist perspectives, right? Claims, but those are so tied to land and to specific geographical entities. And perhaps if we think about xenophobia, as we've been saying, it has this sort of broader intent where it doesn't even matter if there's incursion onto land, but there's a broader sense of pushing outward. And I saw that I was talking over Jeremy just now, so I'm gonna let cede the floor to Jeremy.
You weren't talking over me. I hadn't said a thing. I think it's clear that none of these terms is totally satisfactory for what she is talking about. For example, there are nativists who want to encourage some kinds of immigration. They want more people from Northern and Western Europe, for example, even though legally speaking, they are foreigners. And I imagine that she may have settled on xenophobia because, after all, the book is dealing with immigration legislation, which by definition is, concerned with who can come into the country from outside, and it may or may not have racial connotations. As far as the use of the term race is concerned, I think we need to bear in mind how much the definition of that term changed and continues to change over the period that she's talking about here. In the 19th and well into the 20th century, it was common to talk about race. I've just finished reading a book about the use of the term race about Jews in the 1920s and 1930s, for example, and there were references to an Italian race and a Mexican race, and the term didn't have always the same connotations that we give it today. So if she had used that in the title, it might have been seen as somewhat misleading also, or reading present day concerns back into a context where the term would have had a different kind of meaning. But I found the chapters we read quite powerful, and especially the second one, the earlier one, is material which I think has been written about by a number of authors, but the interpretation, the analysis of the 1965 Immigration Act struck me at least as more original and more provocative. I don't know how those of you who are experts in the subject feel about it.
I went to see if I couldn't find a big fat book that I got in my last trip to Mexico, which is called Xenophobia in Mexico, which has a whole series of articles, one including the Chinese and Asians in Mexico. But there the question is going back to the famous line of whitening. In Latin America, the interest in immigration is to whiten the population. It's a big deal at the end of the 19th century and the earliest 20th century. So there is, xenophobia makes a lot of sense because Latin Americans don't like to talk about racism. They say the United States is racism and Latin America is not racism, while it is totally racist. But of course, racism in Latin America has turned on the indigenous people. But anyway, I just wanted to add that.
And I think it's kind of interesting because for Erika Lee in the previous chapter, she kind of included the treatment of Native Americans, the land deprivation, and the treatment of African American, the enslavement, as forms of xenophobia. And anyone has any idea about, like, should we look at those two cases as a form of xenophobia, or do you think it's a historiographical challenge to the American historiography, or do you think that, like, it is indeed a forms of, xenophobia? How do we look at the relationship between xenophobia and Native American enslavement of African American and the later discrimination, Jim Crow laws, in the context of xenophobia?
So I feel like that's a really good question. Like, that's a tough one to answer quickly, but I think there's a really interesting labor component to the xenophobia presented here. There's a discussion of, like, Samuel Gompers, and so I think there's something there to look more into in the connection of labor protectionism and the fear of others, the fear of immigration, that kind of almost transcends racial binaries in the United States and kind of encompasses anyone not white coming to the US.
And I think labor is a really important component of this, right? Because when Asians were first sort of brought over to America, Central and some parts of South America, it was to replace slave labor because they were coming in around the time slavery was becoming, or they started coming in when importing slaves got banned, which meant that no new slaves were being brought in from Africa and other parts of the world, which meant that there was need for more labor. What do we do? And they look to Asia. It's the same with, Chinese immigrants and Japanese immigrants and Filipino immigrants and so on and so forth in Hawaii and the United States, because they are, like, initially heavily recruited using false pretenses, right? Like, we're going to pay you really well, and after 3 years, you're going to be rich, and we have your ticket back home after 3 years. And then they come in and, they kind of have to labor in sort of like slave-ish, they are indentured servants, but they do have to experience heavy labor. But then when there's, like, deemed too many of them, all of a sudden they become a threat, and they become this entity who is, like, taking away work from white people. And so it's almost like, especially in the 19th century, it's almost like they're not wanted, but they need to be controlled, right? So they have to be, like, admitted and then released on America's terms, and they can't like go out of this particular field of labor that they are in. So, they are not promised upward mobility. They're just there to do their own thing for a limited amount of time, and then they have to go out of the country. And, a lot of the United States was sort of built on these kinds of hard labor of immigrants who were sort of later thought to be unwanted.
To me, something really fascinating about the, I guess, really the middle quarters of the 19th century, depending on where you look, and a little bit later, I guess, and if you're talking about places like Brazil and Cuba, is on the one hand you have this. It's really the labor market had been globalized under the slave trade for centuries, right? But there's an intensification of that sort of globalization of labor and the demand for certain kinds of labor pretty much at the moment of emancipation and as a replacement workforce, as Akiko was pointing out. And so you have in a lot of white settler countries this need to import labor and a kind of labor which white people aren't supposed to perform, or in many cases, there's this perception that if we're talking about tropical commodity production, that they're physiologically unsuited to doing that kind of work. And of course, there's a long history of racialized discourse around tropical labor, but there's this perceived need to bring in to produce stuff undesirable races. But at the same time you bring them in, then you need to sort of draw new color lines to control their admission, to control their terms of admission, and to ultimately control their terms of exclusion. And an example that I've been looking at recently is sort of Australian labor importation after the end of convict transportation, which ends through most of Australia by about 1850. And then you have the Australian gold rushes, and tens of thousands of Chinese laborers come to work the gold fields, and they're really unwelcome there. And some of the earliest legislation in the world restricting Chinese immigration is passed by the colonies of New South Wales and Victoria in the mid 1850s. But if you look at Australia about 15 years later, there's this perception that you need to bring in workers of color to work the sugar plantations as they open up in the north of Australia. That's a tropical commodity which white people aren't supposed to produce. And so it leads to all sorts of complexities in the way white settlers and white settler governments think about labor and race, and how to maximize global commodity production in the context of a world which is becoming which is being policed to become more white at a time when they need more labor, which is perceived to be unacceptable for white laborers to carry out. And it leads to a host of contradictions.
And I think another good example of that racialized labor is about Chinese laundrymen in the United States, and they were specifically feminized to make sure of their exclusion from other employment, but but by feminizing them to justify their work as laundrymen, as cook, as domestic servant. I think that's just one, or in some cases, Filipino farmers in California. And those are all kind of racialized form of labor. And I think in terms of labor, I really want to bring in another topic, which is related to the kind of Marxist analysis of labor and race and immigration. I think especially in the US context. So how should we interpret the relationship between white labor organizations and xenophobia, nativism, and racism? I think this one I think is based on the chapter 3, which we read about Samuel Gompers, right? He wrote that famous little pamphlet. I think that's free of access online. You can easily find, kind of ridiculous. But the question is, how do we understand these working class xenophobia, working class racism, and working class nativism? Is it just a way of the traditional conventional kind of divide and conquer that employed by capitalists, by elites, by white supremacists, or is it something that rooted in the white working class consciousness? How do we explain their actions?
Sishu, I almost wanted to kind of flip that question back to you, because I'm really curious actually about the structure of the book and the way that she has framed this as a series of episodes all around the idea of xenophobia, but they involve pretty disparate actors, right? Policymakers, workers, elites in some of the earlier chapters, right? And so do you think that she's telling us that there's sort of a filtering down of xenophobic effect or thought that's happening, and so it's coming to workers after a certain point? Or do you think she's telling us something about constancy of xenophobia? I'd love to hear from other people, but I thought Sishu might be well able to kind of think about the choice that the author has made here, because, you know, in writing this as one history, she's doing something really positive in giving us comparisons and juxtapositions. On the other hand, the actors get really kind of muddled, at least from my kind of dipping into the book. And so I was really curious from your perspective of having read the whole book and thought with it, what you think about that question.
I think actually I'm quite confused about this question from the beginning, even before reading her book, about is xenophobia and racism a bottom-up or a top-down thing? And this, I think the reason why I want to raise this question, because I was also reading about the 1943 Mobile, Alabama race riot in Mobile, Alabama, in the case which black workers, when black workers were promoted, and the white workers were the one who rioted and commit violence against blacks at the time. So that's the reason why to be honest, I'm quite confused at this point. So I'm trying to figure out the order of, you know, it's like a chicken and eggs kind of question. So which one came first? You know, is it the working class, or is it from the top down kind of structure that, you know, filtered down like this idea of racist idea, xenophobia idea? So I'm not sure if I answered that question, but hopefully someone can answer it for me.
A dialectic going on there. I mean, you're looking for a single factor answer, which you're not going to find.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right, and I don't think it's especially helpful to try to think of it as one or the other. Although I do tend to, and I'll just move on to a different point, I guess. But I also am not a fan of the way we talk about the labor movement's relationship to immigration and nativism as if it was this one monolithic block that that sort of changes into something else. There's always been pro, immigrant unions and pro-immigrant unionists. Like the AFL-CIO didn't really change its anti-immigrant stance until like the year 2000, which is insane to think about. But that's very recent, right? But it's not like they were the only ones that were part of the labor movement. There were labor organizers in the 1930s and in the 50s and 60s, and certainly by the 1970s, who were organizing immigrants, even undocumented immigrants. So I think it really depends on context of looking at where and when these movements are happening. But there just isn't one, labor movement stance on immigration. It is always varied from depending on place and time.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. That reminds me of the Cuban Communist Party in the 1930s and 40s about their policy of pro-immigrants and their earlier stance on immigration. And I think that's a really good answer there. And I think Dr. Popkin just mentioned like he's really into that, the second chapter from our, the local collection, the chapter 7 about the 1965 Immigration Act, which can be seen as a liberal act that greatly expanded opportunity for immigrants from non-European world. But as Erika Lee argues, Johnson's declaration of an end to discrimination only masked the perseverance of xenophobia and the inauguration of colorblind xenophobia. I think that's a really interesting term. The term colorblind has shown up quite frequently in recent scholarships related to race, ethnicity. So I think the one question I want to raise here is what is this colorblind racism and xenophobia? And how does Erika Lee explain this transformation from, the old explicit xenophobia to the less explicit, or to say implicit, colorblind xenophobia? How does, Dr. Popkin?
I want to come back to the question of labor opposition to immigration, and perhaps ask if the term xenophobia is really always appropriate to that argument. It is deeply woven into the history of the American labor movement, but also labor movements in other countries. And I'm thinking of France's history with immigration. France in the Western world is the other great country of immigration in the 20th century, are we in danger of stigmatizing union groups that try to protect their position in the in the economic system by limiting immigration, by automatically labeling that xenophobic and racist? In a way, the converse of that would be to say that the employers who want to be able to bring these workers in, are doing it because they are anti-racist, which is clearly in many cases not the case. They're doing it because it's to their economic advantage. But it may be that by overemphasizing the idea of xenophobia, we're giving a kind of one-sided reading to the reactions of some of these union groups.
Yeah, so I think that's where whiteness really comes into like an important stage here, because the whiteness allows both the employers and the maybe workers enacting xenophobic aggression to kind of be a part of the same mechanisms of power. And so while the employers are looking to marginalize these new arrivals to keep wages down, the same sort of function is happening with the racism and xenophobia directed at these people from, the bottom up, so to speak.
Mm.
I think that's true, but then what do we do with, like, I write about Cesar Chavez and his really complicated relationship with immigrants. This was the quintessential Chicano brown movement, right? And they were for a long time very anti-immigrant, to the point of creating their own border patrol and beating immigrants on the border. So what do we do with that? And
we saw some of this in the analysis of last fall's elections, where
right.
You had these counties along the Texas border that are heavily Latino, which voted more heavily than expected for Trump because they support the stopping of further immigration.
Yeah, and it's tough, but like Chavez was genuinely concerned about what was happening to his union and to his movement.
Yeah,
and you can't deny that the influx of immigration at the time, and specifically in Central California, was causing a lot of heartache, a lot of problems for the movement. Now they eventually kind of find a way out of it, but it was a genuine concern for Chavez and for other Mexican Americans. What do we do with immigrants who were making organizing really, really difficult?
So shall we move on to chapter 7? And I think the first, I think we should come back to chapter 7 a little bit. So Dr. Popkin mentioned like the chapter 7 was quite refreshing early on. And so what do you think, Eric, what kind of historical innovation did in terms of historiography of the 1965 Immigration Act do you think she brings in here in that chapter?
Well, I know nothing about the historiography on the 1965 Act. I only lived through the period, but it was a new way for me of understanding the law. It has, in the journalistic treatments I've read about it, it's always referred to as the great liberalization of American immigration law, and the emphasis is put on the abolition of racial categories. And Lee is persuasive, I think, about showing that it substitutes one system of discrimination for another. So I can see there's much more to talk about than the kind of standard liberal interpretation of it that I've seen. But the question that was left hanging in my mind, and since I haven't read the rest of Lee's book, I don't know how she deals with it. Is her book really meant as an argument that we should have no immigration restrictions at all that they are always inherently illegitimate, and is that a plausible argument in the context of American politics? Is that something that we could ever really imagine having majority support?
I thought in the chapter 7, I agree that she did a great job sort of taking down this assumption about what the effects of the law were and also what the logics were behind it. So,
Yeah.
for example, the kind of numbers where she's pointing about these equivalencies of quotas between Togo and China and Mexico and elsewhere in South America, it just didn't make any sense, and they seem so blindsided in their insistence on a false equation of equality that has no context in social reality, and so it gives us a sense of what is lost in these sort of rigid senses of policymaking that we often accept because they look good on the surface level. And then just following up on what Jeremy was just asking, is there an argument for a future without xenophobia or without exclusion? Maybe. I think that I was thinking more about this juxtaposition of terms that she could have used in the book title, right? And she could have said a history of exclusion, and that would just map onto immigration policy and moves towards exclusion. But I think she does say that the important thing is that xenophobia is dehumanizing against those that are being excluded. And so it's necessary to emphasize that dehumanizing aspect has been consistent and is the problem that she's trying to target and encourage us to move past. And so is there a possibility for policies that involve exclusion or involve delimitation without them being dehumanizing? Might be the question that's being asked here.
Yeah, I actually thought that this chapter is the least original of her book. So many of the questions that she tackles here, I think have been, if not settled, we've been discussing them since at least early 2000s. But May Nye, wrote extensively about this paradox of 1965, the way that it liberalizes immigration in some ways and then creates the modern problem of legal immigration.
Well, I need to take your course, obviously.
Yeah. But the thing that I still, can't understand and that I can't figure out really is how no one saw this coming. And I'm sure no one is saying no one is overstating it, but so few policymakers understood what this policy was going to create, and she doesn't really give us an answer here, and I don't have an answer either. It's just such a big question, and it seems odd that it's not something that people saw coming. And speaking of May Nye, she calls this, paraphrasing, but something like a problem that can't be solved, because there's always this huge tension between liberal views of immigration policy and then the unintended consequences that always seem to prop up once legislation is passed. It happens in 65, it happens again in the 80s, it happens in the 90s, and it's still happening.
I wonder though if the consequences are unintended, because I'm also thinking about the 1924 Johnson-Reed Immigration Act that sort of barred all immigration from Asia and then put in place a quota system, right, for the rest of the world. And it was very intentional, right, to encourage immigration from Western Europe and Northern Europe and discourage immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, because they created the quota system based on the 1890 census, when they could have used 1900, 1910, 1920, right? But they used the numbers from 1890 when there were very few immigrants in the United States from the undesirable areas, right? I should put that in quotes, undesirable. which meant that they were very consciously creating this quota system in order to exclude immigration from particular areas of the world. And I wonder, that was very much intentional. So I'm not quite sure if the 1965 was unintentional.
Well, just to speak up, I mean, you're talking about trying to exclude my ancestors, Jeremy's, Karen's, Francie's, except they were probably already here by 1921 and 24, in terms of, I know my Italian grandparents were. But coming to what he wants to say about chapter 7, I was pleased to see Emmanuel Seller. That's a name I hadn't heard in years and years and years, as a long-term liberal congressman from New York who was involved with that. And I also enjoyed the picture signing from Liberty Island before the World Trade Center was built. Because there's not there in the background in 1965. It only went up in 1970 for those younger folks who might not realize that.
Yep, and I think in terms of that, we are also talking about immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europeans, and I was here quoting Erika Lee says she said the 1965 Act extended both the civil rights rhetoric and the legal principle of non-discrimination to all European immigrants. Well, in the other book, in the history of the white people, historian Neil Painter named the period after World War II, and especially this period, 1965, the third enlargement of American whiteness. So then I think the question came here is, what do you think is the role of US immigration policy in shaping and reshaping American whiteness and white identity? Or we can say maybe in the context of this book, it's not just immigration policy, but also xenophobia. What kind of role did they play in shaping the white identity of the United States?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been, oh, sorry.
No, please.
Right, as an Italian American immigrant, or the children of a grandchild of Italian American immigrants, I've always been interested in this sort of process of becoming white, right? Which is clearly the case for families like sort of like my family, right? Where there's this, and I think this actually there's I think that we're struggling with. We haven't touched gender, but we're really struggling on the relationship of race and class here, right? And I think the question of labor, the question of the sort of the possibilities for whiteness, where some immigrants have that possibility for whiteness, and within a generation or two generations, the sort of the Southern the Italians and the Eastern Europeans, sort of manage to navigate this because of skin color or because of conception of being able to transform into white, right? I just find that a really sort of fascinating situation. And when my family's immigration history is very clear. When they arrived in the in the 19 teens, they're on the bottom rung, right, of American society, but they have, because of their European descent, they have this possibility to climb into whiteness, whereas obviously other immigrants do not. And I find that extremely interesting, that process by which the whiteness can be constructed in that way, but also the sort of, it's clearly also about class, because they have to climb class out of class in order to, as well as they're also climbing into whiteness.
For the book I'm writing at the moment, I have been reading some of the literature on American Jewish immigrants, and there has been a very influential book by Karen Brodkin on how the Jews became white, but it has been challenged by another impressive book by Eric Goldstein, who has argued that Jews were more ambivalent than we might think about wanting to merge with the the general white population. And he shows that in the 20s and 30s, Jews continue to use the term the Jewish race themselves because it gives them an argument as to why Jews should not intermarry, for example, why Jews should maintain a separate identity in the United States that isn't based on religion, because they recognize that many immigrant Jews have given up religious practices altogether. So I think, there are complications in this assumption that European immigrant groups automatically want to merge with the white majority. Sometimes they have their own reasons for wanting to maintain a certain distance from it. But I think it is certainly true that the groups that were classified as non-white have a totally different set of problems and possibilities. That option is not there for them in the same way.
But on the other side of that coin, Jillian, are you going to talk? Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to bring back your point about Latin America and say, in answer to Sishu's question, that I think the United States is much more like Latin America than I think it wants to admit in terms of a project of whitening. I remember in studying Brazil and Branqueamento and wanting to whiten the population. I think that that's still there. It's not as explicit in terms of policy, but I'm thinking also of, the end of slavery and then the creation of Liberia, and this idea that, okay, we've extracted this labor. Now let's work on this project of moving African Americans back, quote unquote, to Africa. And so that labor question is very interesting in terms of, what Dr. Takanaka said, like, for this moment we can use you, but then we don't actually want there to be permanence. So I think that the xenophobia in relation to that is very interesting to think about. But also I'm just thinking that I think the Americas itself, that it's had this whitening project on. The US is just way less explicit about it.
I was going to flip Jeremy's point and say, well, yes, there is that this is part of the Jewish population that wants to, desperately hold on to a culture, to a religion. I think it's fascinating right now and disturbing. At the same time, you don't see Proud Boys going after Italians or Irish and to any degree. And so Jewish whiteness, even though, people like Stephen Miller and, the son of a rabbi, I think, a Jewish judge in New York, who was part of the people who attacked the Capitol on January 6th, who are, holding on to this, wanting to be so badly part of this whiteness. I think Jewish whiteness is definitely getting a little bit more tenuous nowadays with the rise of white supremacy in the United States. So while you have people who might want to hold on and become, more separatist, on the other hand, you have these people who are, trying so hard to be white that they become white supremacists, while the white supremacists are attacking our anti-Semites. Pretty complicated.
Yeah.
We might have to also bring up color in this, and I turn my camera off because I have low bandwidth, but we have to also bring up color spectrums and darkness and lightness, and being able to tell what someone is as an important aspect of targeting different groups of people too. So even if, this is changing, whiteness may be changing on the Jewish population, as you say, who can't it change from? And I just remember, when this first came about, when COVID first came about, like seeing certain people covering their faces as to not be seen. So I think that's part of the conversation too, not that, you know, everybody in this category looks the same or has the same relationship to whiteness or blackness even, but there's even nuance between and among that.
This is really fascinating to think about. And I sort of wanted to connect it back to what Karen was saying about class in terms of the types of exceptions that have always been involved in these types of policies. So for example, thinking about Chinese immigration, I learned from this book, although I guess I always knew in the back of my head that there was this really dramatic class exception, right? And I can think in my head of examples of highly mobile intellectuals that are moving back and forth between China and the United States during the point of these most virulent exclusionary policies. And so it's interesting to think about the idea of mobility as being attached to kind of an elite status. And then these policies are not only exclusionary, but they're also enforcing a sense of lack of mobility. That then sort of creates a real problem for the people that are in the middle of it. I'm not sure how to fit these things in, but it enforces class by reducing possibilities for mobility, right? So the Chinese workers that in an earlier generation could go back and forth now have to make the choice to either stay or leave permanently, and no other choice there. And I can see that extending forward to other populations that are being targeted here. But for Chinese and for many other groups, right, there's always an excluded class, and we still have, you know, what do you call high talent visas and those types of setups, right? And so those aren't as much a part of the story here, but they're an interesting element of it.
And I think throughout the book, you know, after reading the whole book, what I get, you know, what I sense from the whole book is like the idea of the xenophobia as a central institution. I think it's to maintain white supremacy instead of anything else, because throughout the book, you can see several times of the so-called enlargement of American whiteness. But the definition of blackness or the unassimilability of Asians were hardly challenged throughout the history. So I think that's my kind of conclusion after reading the whole book of this idea of whiteness and xenophobia and how it connected to each other. Yep. Dr. Popkin?
Yeah, of course, I'm struck that in her chapter, she refers to the very rapid increase of immigration from Asia after 1965. And now, you know, we see in these affirmative action court cases like the one that's being brought against Harvard at the moment, where we see people claiming to represent Asian Americans allying themselves with whites to, you know, try to strike down affirmative action for African Americans and Latinos. So has something changed since 1965? You know, can we still speak of systematic exclusion of Asians in American society, or is something, you know, is there a transformation going on there?
I think it would be hard to see a whitening of Asian status given the reaction to COVID that happened this spring and is more widespread. That, you know, there's dynamics of protection of status that are involved in those types of lawsuits, but in terms of the types of xenophobic responses, that doesn't carry over.
Yeah.
Well, and I feel like that lawsuit, right? I mean, the lawyer who initiated, encouraged Asian Americans to support the suit is just against affirmative action.
Yes.
And right, I mean, he doesn't give a damn about Asians. He just wants to eliminate affirmative action because, right, he was a part of the lawsuit against, was it UT Austin, right, that went to the Supreme Court of a white woman who
he is an ideologue on this. But how, for example, did Asian Americans vote in California on that referendum last fall? You know, that the proposition was to repeal the law prohibiting affirmative action in university admissions, and it was resoundingly defeated. And vote.
I think here we need to bring in this idea of intersectionality of race and class, of how racial identity can be reformed and reshaped through class identity. And in terms of the affirmative action, the early theory I heard was actually it's not about race issue, but more about an attack on public education system in California. So there are many different theories to explain, the questions related to affirmative action. But I think that Dr. Takenaka has more say on, the Harvard issue. She definitely raised a lot about that, and I'm not quite familiar with that case, but I think perhaps we should put class instead of race when analyzing these questions.
Yeah, and you could really see that in the way that we get the rise of discourse about the quote unquote model minority, right, or model minorities, even as we continue to see anti-Asian discrimination, and those two things happen simultaneously.
And I think the idea of model minority is a form of exclusive inclusion. It kind of define what kind of people the country wants. But at the same time, it tells you that these people are always foreigners. So I think there's this dual identity that, makes this issue really much more complicated than I think maybe people are supposedly thinking about.
Yeah.
And I think I have another question that I really want to bring in, regarding maybe the chapter 3, the Chinese, exclusion chapter. So the question kind of is, what do you think is the historical significance of Chinese Exclusion Act? And in general, the American immigration system and American racial politics, what do you think is its legacy to not just American history, but to world history? I think this is a topic that we can expand it to a little bit to other fields of history. Because definitely, if you heard the name Madison Grant, right? Madison Grant, his book, The Passing of the Great Race, has been held as a Bible by the Nazi Germany at the time. And American system, especially, Jim Crow laws are well studied in Nazi Germany at the time, of how Nazi Germany enforcing its own version of segregation, and then later, what led to the Holocaust. So I think the one question here regarding these chapters is, how do we think of the legacy of this Chinese Exclusion Act? I mean, I think the most relevant cases is the pretty, controversial topic of Mexican and Latin American immigration currently, right? We are thinking about their status and their connection back to the Chinese Exclusion Act, of the system that was created to restrict immigration.
I'm thinking more so of even more recent events, with it being used as a possible way to try to, keep Chinese people from coming in during the Trump administration. So it can be used as a precedent for, depending on who's in government, to say, okay, this is a danger. And whether underneath that has to do with American world competition with China in terms of imperialism, or whether, and then making the sort of like a virus some kind of threat that comes out of a specific place, that lie. So I think that just like there's a tradition of resistance, that people can use that history as a reason to then continue to exclude those populations.
Thank you.
I mean, as a 19th century specialist, I see it as one fairly dramatic example of really a global trend. of using legislation to restrict immigration, which becomes a fad really among white settler countries the world over in the last quarter of the 19th century. There's a really terrific book by Marilyn Lake and I forget the co-author, called "Drawing the Global Color Line," which is sort of a global history of this phenomenon, and it's something that you see in all of the white settler nations of the British Commonwealth going on at exactly the same time. And Chinese exclusion tends to lead the way in virtually all of those places during that same period.
And
then,
yep.
So sorry, the
Please.
Chinese Exclusion Act, right? When it was passed, Asians weren't really a category that was being recognized by the United States, right? And so a lot of the immigration acts prior, like the Naturalization Act, when it was revised to include African Americans, they weren't thinking about immigrants from Asia, and that was left intact. And so when after these exclusion acts against Asians, there are a series of really fascinating lawsuits by Asians trying various logics to prove that they are white, because a lot of the immigration laws before 1882 didn't really think about Asians as a problem. And so like they'd be pointing back to the Naturalization Act of 1790 and then the amendment of I forget what year it was, to include African Americans. And then they would point to that and say like, but Asians aren't included or excluded from these acts, so I'm allowed to be white because Asia as a category doesn't exist in these kinds of immigration laws. And so it's kind of, all of a sudden they become a problem. And so a lot of lawsuits are like, there was this Indian guy from northern India who is of, and he's sort of like, I am white because I am Aryan, right? Because like the religion that originated from the area he came from, right? And so I am Aryan and therefore I should be able to naturalize. And then there was a Japanese guy saying, I am of high class and my skin is whiter than like this white person here, and therefore I should be able to naturalize. And this lack of category of Asia reminded me of the story of Paul Ceran when he came to Kentucky, right? The late geographer from India, right? Like he got his PhD in Indiana, and then he got a job somewhere in the Southeast. He was driving through Kentucky, his car broke down. He noticed that there's a university and he just visited the university. He was chatting around, and then the Dean of Arts and Sciences was like, I can give you a job, just come work for us. And he's like, oh, cool. And then like, they are signing a contract. He's signing the contract with the dean. And then so he writes his name and then he writes his address and then that. And then there's a box like white, black. And Paul's like, what do I do? And the dean's like, well, you're not white, so just check off black. And like, he just left it that way. And then the dean didn't like his name because it was too long. And then the dean was like, okay, you're Paul from now. I'm naming you Paul. And he's kind of stuck with it. But that was such a fascinating story. And it kept coming back to me as I was like studying up on late 19th century, immigration laws about Asia.
I heard him tell that story several times, and I always wondered how it was even possible. In 1956, I assume he must have been one of the very first non-white faculty members hired.
I think this book, it centers the United States, and that's clearly its intention. But in terms of thinking about the significance of this 1882 law and these actions, we can also think about ripple effects outward, right? So acts of protest and boycott in China against this law and surrounding these types of exclusionary practices are part of its modern political history and part of a tradition of protest and anti-foreign sentiment that emerges in reaction to what's happening in the United States. And so it'll be fascinating to think about each of these chapters moving outward in terms of information of it and reactions, and a sense of response, and might give us a fuller sense of this question of, is this a history of xenophobia as sentiment, as action, as law? What is that part of it?
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what I want more from the book, from the author, is more of a transnational perspective. For example, in chapter 3, there are some transnational aspects to talking to you about how did some of the Chinese understood these serious restrictions. But at the same time, I really want to hear more information across the Pacific of how the international, how other countries view, especially those countries affected greatly by these acts, how they view these acts at the time. I think it could provide a better perspective, a much fuller picture here, I think. And I think as the last question is quite, that I want to ask is because I'm teaching History 109 this semester, which is American history. So it's kind of centered around my own experience. And as you can see, as the number of anti-Asian hate crimes rises drastically in the past few months, and I think thanks to the former president. And is there anything from Erika Lee's work that we can use to teach American history or history in general in this post-Trump era? How should we incorporate some of the things from this book into the teaching, I think? Because Dr. Summers this semester, he described much more, knowledge about immigrants and minorities in his lecture from what I see. And I find it quite encouraging, to be honest. And how can we use this book to teach, to enrich some of the weaponry of our teaching here, I think, of American history, I think, in specific.
Well, just from a sort of a layperson's perspective here, just the fact that this, to teach our students that this has a history, right? That the immigration problems that are, sort of on the agenda today didn't just show up out of nowhere, right? They're part of specific events that happened at specific moments in the past that are connected to other trends, right? It seems to me that that's the heart of what we always try to do when we're teaching. But here, I mean, for example, that the 1965 Act is that, engendered all of the, many of the issues and questions that we have today, and that, are making those problems unsolvable. That's very, very relevant, right? It's not as if suddenly, one day Donald Trump woke up and, oh, we need a wall. This is a long-standing part of American history that has to be unraveled for much further back.
Yeah, Sishu, I teach 109, and so we've recently covered immigration and thinking about, and I like to point to this idea that history may not repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme a lot. And hearing the rhymes and thinking about immigrants as contagion, how this debate has been framed over time as economic competition, and helping students see the conversations that they're having and hearing swirling around them are conversations that have been going on for a very long time. And part of what we try and do when I teach 109 is understand, what does it mean to be an American? And you can't answer that question without really grappling with the immigrant story in the United States.
Yeah, I would also say it gives students a chance to see the consequences of these conversations and policies that happened in the past. That, these sorts of conversation about who belongs are never benign. And so students can maybe get a better grasp of what the implications are for the politics going on contemporarily.
Yeah, and
I think it's very important because mine's not going to be about incorporating into US history because, right, I'm just teaching about Asians in America and it is US history, but just focused on the Asian experience. And a lot of the feedback I get from the students is like, why did I not learn this? Why did no one teach me this? I had no idea, is what a lot of the students are saying. So I think it's really worth it to incorporate a lot of this material into US history. I think the students will appreciate it.
I think it's also a great example of, if you wanted to do an exercise of law, talking about law and what's legal and what has been legal, and just sort of troubling that whole dynamic that students sometimes come in with, that everything that the government has done has been right and legal, and kind of troubling with that a little bit, I think will be important.
Yeah, or even the definition, right, of legal and illegal, especially when we talk immigrants. And undocumented people being called illegal, for example, in the eyes and ears of many people today, they frame it as, well, it's illegal, so it's wrong. But I think there's an opportunity here to show how what is legal and what isn't, or who is deemed to be legal or illegal, is is made up, or is the result of choices, of policy choices. It's not something that's natural. It's something that governments and societies have crafted over time.
Yeah, but it raises a question in a world of nation states, which is the world we live in. Is any nation state prepared to say that anybody can come from anywhere at any time and become part of our community? Do we need to put into question the whole concept of the nation state in order to imagine a world in which that might be possible? Because one thing, if we overly politicize the presentation of this, one thing I think we risk is a kind of backlash in which we would get students saying, well, that proves that Trump was right. The only policy that we should have is to keep everybody out.
I guess I would say to that nation states have a history too, and that some indigenous folks would be glad to trouble with those political and physical markers.
Indeed, and that would take us into some very different discussions. And of course, one thing we haven't really dealt with in this discussion is that the situation of Native Americans and African Americans is very different. They are not immigrant groups. They have been part of the population in what's now the United States since before there was a United States. And the issue of racism and discrimination against these groups is not always identical with the debates about immigrants.
Yeah, but I do think the experience of Chinese immigrants and African Americans are connected in many occasions. If we consider, the series of laws in California during the 1850s, 1860s, well, the nation was fighting a war to emancipate enslaved people. At the same time, they're enacting laws to restrict Chinese from receiving social welfare, from the restricting from them from the legal rights. And at the time it was framed as, because I think Dr. Takenaka mentioned a little while ago, because they were slavish, because these people resembles slavery. The nature of these people are like slaves. And I think in many, and also in the case of Mexican immigrants in the United States, their illegality will connect all the way back to Chinese immigrants who cross the border illegally. And I think those are not totally separate. And I think at some occasion we can connect them together.
No, they're not totally separate,
Yeah,
but they're not totally the same
yes.
either.
Yeah, but there were no exclusion laws against Mexico in the early 20th century. Mexicans went back and forth, and over 100,000 Mexicans came during the Mexican Revolution, or easily came into the United States. And it wasn't until the 1930s and the Depression when we begin to get the deportation of Mexicans during. So it was different in to your question about, how the 1924 law affected, it did not affect Mexicans. It's a different, a totally different context at that moment. Later on, maybe there's similarities.
And I think that's it from me.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Sishu, for leading us. This has been a
thank
really
you.
engaging conversation, speaking for myself, and I think for everyone here. I know I learned a lot, both from the book and your discussion of it, but also from everyone here. And so thanks for joining us. I just wanted to remind everyone that our next session is 2 weeks from today. It's gonna be a little change, not really change of method, maybe. It's gonna be Steve Davis's presentation on natural language processing and South African digital archives. I don't have the title right in front of me, but I hope you'll join us and we can learn quite a bit new. So thank you all.
Bye-bye.